Act 1, The Nightmare of Financial Collapse. The sound of Big Ben's chimes is drowned out by the roar of Soviet jet engines circling the London skyline. Their nuclear payloads aimed directly at the heart of the empire. On the streets below, the pride of 1,000 years has vanished. Grocery store shelves are stripped bare, and the heavy iron shutters of bakeries are locked tight. Because the nation's credit has been revoked, making it impossible to import even a single bushel of wheat. This is London, in a world where Britain refused to blink. By Monday morning, the British pound, once the bedrock of global trade, is treated as nothing more than scrap paper. In New York, the American government has just liquidated its massive holdings of British debt, triggering a financial tsunami that has wiped out the savings of every British family in 48 hours. There are no soldiers in the streets of London, yet the city has been conquered. The weapon of choice was not the atomic bomb, but the American ledger. For decades, we have been told that the British Empire faded away gracefully. But the truth is much darker. It was a brutal, calculated financial execution performed by its closest ally. To understand how we reached this point of total collapse, we must go back to the moment the victory of World War II turned into a permanent debt trap. Act 2, Bloody Legacy and Empty Ledgers. In May 1945, the streets of London were a sea of flags and cheering crowds. Winston Churchill stood on the balcony of Whitehall, flashing the victory sign to a nation that believed it had saved the world. But behind the closed doors of the Treasury, the mood was funeral. The war against Hitler had been won, but it had come with a price tag that the British Empire simply could not pay. According to official records, Britain's national debt had skyrocketed from £500 million to over £3.5 billion, an amount equivalent to 250% of its annual GDP. For 6 years, Britain had poured everything into the fire. 55% of its entire economy had been dedicated to total war. Its gold reserves had shrunk by over 90%, and its factories were either rubble or hopelessly outdated. The United States had entered the war as the world's greatest factory, but it emerged as the world's only banker, holding over 75% of the entire planet's gold reserves. While American cities boomed with new consumer goods, Britain remained under strict rationing. In a cruel twist of history, British citizens in 1946 were often living on less food and fuel than they had during the height of the Blitz. Then, just days after the Japanese surrender, Washington delivered a brutal, calculated blow. Without warning, President Truman abruptly canceled the Lend-Lease program. This was the financial Dunkirk. Overnight ships carrying vital supplies of grain, oil, and medicine to British ports were ordered to turn back or demand immediate payment in US dollars, currency that London simply did not have. A $5 billion hole opened in the British budget instantly. The message from the White House was cold and clear. The friendship was a wartime necessity, but the debt was a business reality. America didn't just want its money back. It wanted to dismantle the British imperial trade monopoly. Britain was no longer a partner. It was a bankrupt entity in desperate need of a bailout to avoid literal starvation. Act 3, the 1946 loan, a poisoned chalice. In late 1945, a frail and aging John Maynard Keynes, the most brilliant economist of his generation, boarded a ship to Washington. He was not there to discuss economic theory. He was there to beg for the survival of his country. Keynes initially sought a non-repayable grant of $5 billion, arguing that Britain's financial ruin was the direct result of holding the front line for the free world alone for 2 years. He believed in the moral obligation of the Allies, but he was walking into a lion's den of cold-blooded pragmatism. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson and William Clayton, saw Britain not as a wounded hero, but as an inefficient old monopoly that needed to be dismantled to make way for American expansion. The resulting Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946 was less a rescue mission and more an orchestrated takeover. Washington agreed to a $3.75 billion loan at 2% interest, but the fine print contained a poison pill that would haunt London for decades. The Americans demanded that within 1 year, Britain must make the pound sterling freely convertible into US dollars. To the average citizen, this sounded like a technicality, but to a financier, it was a death sentence. It meant that any nation holding British pounds could immediately trade them for dollars to buy superior American goods. When the convertibility clause was triggered in July 1947, the disaster was instantaneous. Global investors, sensing the weakness of the British economy, dumped their pounds in a massive coordinated sell-off. In just 6 weeks, Britain's precious dollar reserves, intended to last for 5 years, evaporated as hundreds of millions were drained from the treasury. Keynes's dream of a managed recovery was shattered. By forcing this clause, the United States had effectively decapitated the pound's role as the world's primary reserve currency, ensuring that the dollar would reign supreme. Britain had survived the war, but it had just sold its financial soul to stay afloat, beginning a 61-year debt repayment journey that would only end in December 2006. Act 4. The Suez Crisis. The moment the mask slipped. By 1956, the illusion of British power was still flickering, but it was fueled entirely by borrowed time and American patience. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, he didn't just seize a waterway, he severed the jugular vein of the British Empire. This canal was the artery through which 2/3 of Western Europe's oil flowed. For Prime Minister Anthony Eden, this was the moment to prove that Britain was still a lion. Along with France and Israel, Britain launched a brilliant military strike, quickly seizing control of the Canal Zone. On the battlefield, it was a total victory, but in the global markets, it was a suicide mission. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was incensed not by the war itself, but by the defiance of American leadership. He realized that to break Britain, he didn't need to fire a single bullet. He simply needed to call in the debt. As the British military celebrated their tactical success, the American Treasury began a massive, coordinated sell-off of British sterling. This triggered a currency run so severe that Britain lost 15% of its total gold and foreign exchange reserves in just a few days. The Bank of England warned Eden that the pound was hours away from a total collapse that would make the Great Depression look like a minor correction. This is where the nightmare from our opening scene almost became a reality. When Eden turned to the International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan to save the pound, the United States exercised its ultimate veto. The message was a brutal ultimatum: withdraw from Suez within 24 hours, or we will crush your currency and leave your economy in ruins. It was the ultimate financial blackmail. For the first time in history, a superpower was defeated not by an enemy's army, but by its best friend's ledger. Britain was forced to retreat in global humiliation, proving to the world that its sovereignty was an illusion. The lion had been muzzled not by a cage, but by a checkbook. Act 5. The $35 trillion warning, the conclusion. Today, America itself is falling into the very debt trap it once used to break the British Empire. The United States stands exactly where Britain once stood, as the world's primary debtor and the sole guardian of the global reserve currency. For 80 years, we have enjoyed the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, using it to fund our global military footprint and our domestic deficits. But as we look at the ruins of the British pound, we must confront the cold mathematics of our own reality. Today, the United States national debt has surpassed a staggering $35 trillion. To put that in perspective, we are now adding $1 trillion to that debt every 100 days. For the first time in history, the interest payments on our debt have surpassed our entire defense budget, costing over $1 trillion annually just to service what we owe. Like Britain in 1945, we are increasingly dependent on the willingness of foreigners to hold our paper. But that willingness is fraying. From the expansion of the BRICS nations to the steady push for de-dollarization, the world is actively searching for an escape hatch from the American ledger. We have used the dollar as a weapon of diplomacy, most recently against Russia, just as we did against the British in 1956. But a weapon loses its sting when the world decides to stop using it. History does not repeat, but it certainly rhymes. The British Empire did not collapse because of a lack of courage. It collapsed because it ran out of money and lost the trust of its creditors. If a Suez moment ever comes for America, a moment where our creditors refuse to roll over our debt, or the world's central banks dump their treasuries, we will find that all our aircraft carriers and nuclear silos cannot save a bankrupt treasury. The fall of Britain was a 30-year warning. As the clock ticks on our $35 trillion mistake, we have to wonder, when the banker finally calls in the debt of the United States, will they be as ruthless as we were to our best friend?